Hello, my name is Adora, and you are welcome to Polomi's Cloud Engineering Summit. I am very excited to be giving this talk today. And in my talk, I would be taking you through how to manage your cloud applications and infrastructure deployments in one CI/CD pipeline. But before I go any further or dive into the main details of today's talk, I would want to quickly introduce myself. So as I had said at the beginning of the talk, my name is Adora, and I am a software engineer at Microsoft Mixed Reality, and I am a tech content creator at Adora Hack. I create a lot of YouTube videos for developers, and I write articles as well. I'm the co-founder of OnStack, which is a community for developers to learn stuff hands-on. So we organize meetups where we mostly do workshops as opposed to anything else. I'm also on the advisory board for VRAR Nigeria, which is the Nigerian chapter for the VRAR Global Association. And in a way, I guess this kind of makes sense because I am somebody that works in mixed reality and somebody that is really enthusiastic about extended reality and what we can do as people that live in this world with that technology. So before anything straight, let's just take a trip down memory lane. Seeing what's currently happening now and how IAC has made a lot of things easier in terms of how we are able to manage our infrastructure. Sometimes we need to think back to where we came from to sort of appreciate where we currently are today, and just looking at what it was in the past for people that were trying to do infrastructure deployments or just even somehow create infrastructure for whatever applications or services, whatever it is that they were trying to build in the past. It was a very tedious and error-prone process, and I'll explain why. So I go to Azure today and I choose to create a resource group. I choose to create an app service plan, and then I go ahead and create a key vault as well. I go ahead and create a static web app as well. I go ahead and create multiple resources that I need to bring my websites to life, right? And as I'm creating these resources, I'm documenting them somehow. But maybe somewhere in the middle of my entire DevOps process, I have a life science or something goes wrong and I have to quickly make some kind of configuration change to the particular environment that had the problem. But somehow I forgot to, for whatever reason, document that change or anything like that. And now the state of the environments that I made that quick fix in and all my other environments will be different. And if I want to now create an entirely new environment, I will be creating off the knowledge that I already have, off the thing that was probably documented. That's if it was actually even documented at all. And it's very difficult to maintain states across, your different environments when you're trying to do deployments in steps. So if you have like a development environment, you have a staging environment, and you have a production environment, you can't confidently say that your staging environment mirrors your production environment or vice versa, because in that moment you're not sure anymore because of individual tweaks you've made here and there just to get something to work, and you weren't maybe for some reason able to document, or it skipped your mind, or it just wasn't even one of those things, right? IAC gives us version control. IAC allows us deploy our things incrementally, and because talking about polomi, it gives us a way to actually apply a certain design pattern to whatever infrastructure definition thing we want to do. Because with polomi, you're going to be using regular programming languages, and then you can now decide, okay, I want to create for the different regions, I want it to be represented in this particular way. So as I'm going to be designing my cloud application, as I'm going to be designing my service, as I'm going to be designing that app, I can also be thinking about ways to actually also design my infrastructure code thing, if that makes sense. Like I said, I think Polomi is amazing because it gives us the ability to create our infrastructure with familiar programming languages. And you can see this storage account over here. So this is Polomi with TypeScript. And during the course of this whole talk, I will be using TypeScript as a reference. But with Polomi, you can actually use a bunch of other programming languages. You can use C#, you can use Python, you can use .NET, and so many more amazing programming languages. So in this particular slide, we can see the TypeScript definition of a storage account. So I want to use Polomi to create a storage account I want to use Polomi's TypeScript to create a storage account resource. And this is how I go ahead to do that. Now that I've given an overview on what Polomi is and what Polomi can sort of like do for us, I tried not to go too deep into that because that's not what this talk is really focused on. But now I've given a brief overview on that, I am going straight into the next part of this talk, which is integrating Polomi as part of our deployment process. And there are two scenarios. So I'm going to be stating each scenario and possible implementations for those scenarios. So the first scenario is, separating infrastructure deployment from our source code deployment. So for whatever reason, and this is not what this talk is focused on, because like I said at the beginning of this talk is focused on being able to deploy our cloud applications and our infrastructure side by side in one CI/CD pipeline. So this is a valid scenario for integrating Polomi as part of our deployment process. And I just want to touch on it before I move on to the next thing, which is the scenario that we actually care about in this context. So the first scenario is separating infrastructure deployment from our source code deployment. And there are basically two ways to do that. And you might want to do this thing for whatever reason at all. The first way is having multiple repos, and then you could have like one repo for where all your infrastructure code would be, and then you could have another repo for where all your application source code would be, basically. The second scenario is having your source and your infrastructure code in the same repo, but having multiple pipelines for those things. And depending on whatever conditions you set, the multiple pipelines will get triggered on different occasions. So it could be that you only want to trigger the pipeline that does the infrastructure deployment when you actually edit code in the infrastructure directory. Every other time you want to run the pipeline that does the source deployment. Or you can decide, however, whatever condition that would make you want to have multiple pipelines and trigger them on different occasions. This is also a second scenario where you can, separate your infrastructure deployment from your source code deployment. And now the second scenario, which is the one we are interested in today's talk, is deploying infrastructure and source code changes simultaneously. Now, in this scenario, there are two ways to implement it. So the first way to implement this is by deploying your infrastructure with Polomi tasks and your source code with some custom YAML templates that you can write yourself. The second scenario would be deploying your infrastructure and your source code with custom Polomi templates. So we're going to talk about using Polomi tasks in an Azure pipeline. And you can do most of all these things regardless of whatever tool that you are using, right? So if you're using GitHub, for example, if you're using Azure DevOps, for example, if you're using anything at all, if you're using Circle CI, you can do all these things. You can do all these things with Polomi as well. But for this talk, I'm basically talking about Azure because that's what I'm more familiar with. So using Polomi tasks in an Azure pipeline, Polomi tasks would help you, handle all the things that you need to do before you actually run the Polomi command. So all the setting up, installing of the Polomi CLI, and all the things that you need. And then all you need to do basically is call is use that polomi task and specify the command you want to call, along with other important things like your polomi access token for authentication. So we can see these two code snippets side by side. One is code for defining a function app resource in polomi using TypeScript, and the other is using polomi tasks, what we would actually need to write to be able to run this polomi thing in Azure pipelines. So as we can see, we have our function app and we've given it the name my function app. We have specified the app service plan, the location, our resource group, and the things that we need in this function app resource. If we want to deploy this function app resource to some Azure subscription so that we can, actually deploy an Azure function there and we can run the code and all of that, we'll be writing some yamo and we'll be writing some polomi tasks. So I have two polomi tasks here because I want to run two different polomi commands. So I've created a polomi task that does a preview for me, a preview on all my resources, just to be able to compare the current polomi state with what I want to do, to decide, okay, how many things do I want to update, how many things do I want to create, how many things am I deleting, and what is actually going to get replaced, just to identify how the state is going to be different. So I just want to be able to see what it looks like, and if it's all good, then go ahead and run a polomi up. And polomi up is actually what upgrades my polomi state to what I have currently specified that I want my new state to be in. So if I had Docker stuff running before and I don't feel like using Docker anymore and I want to switch to a serverless architecture, I can remove all the Docker things and then switch to using a function app in an app service plan and have all those things going for me. So polomi compares that state and does all of that for me. So I would do a polomi preview and do a polomi up. However, if you look at this script properly, all that happens here is the infrastructure updates. It doesn't in any way actually update my source code. And when I started this talk, I talked about deploying our infrastructure and source code side by side in one CI/CD pipeline. So this is not what we need. However, this next thing is closer to what we need, which is after running my polomi preview and my polomi up, I can go ahead to run a custom YAML template that goes to deploy my function to my new polomi resource in Azure for me. And as we can see here, that's what's currently happening on the last line. And as we can see here, the names of the function apps are the same. So the function app name in my code is the same name in the pipeline, so that when I say, okay, I'm creating this template to go and deploy this function for me, it goes to deploy the function to this particular function's resource, to this particular function app. So, alright, this is the first implementation for our scenario that I talked about initially, which is deploying our infra with polomi tasks and deploying our source with custom YAML templates. Now, there's a second way to actually do this, which is the way that I prefer. The second way to do this is using custom polomi scripts in an Azure pipeline. So as opposed to using the polomi tasks themselves, you can customize things to how, you want them to be. And now let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to be talking about this in the context of a function app, but if you are doing Docker and you're doing Docker containers, this also applies as well. But I'm going to be saying this in the context of a function app because I feel it's a lot faster to get by. So polomi has something called an archive function app that allows you deploy a function archive alongside the function app Azure resource when you are running polomi up. So as opposed to just creating an Azure function app, creating that resource, if you use an archive function app and you specify the path to a deployment archive to an actual function, it would also deploy that function for you in one step. So you don't have to do too much. So what this means that unlike the previous scenario, our infra and our source code gets deployed in one step, in one task at once. You don't have to actually do two things. You don't have to create a polomi task and then go ahead to call a custom template that does that. All these things could be done in one step. So here I have my code for an archive function app. We can see that it's a little bit different from what I had before with just the normal function app resource, because now I am adding something called a deployment archive. I want to specify the path to the actual Azure function that I want polomi to help me deploy to my Azure function app resource. I want to have built that function, and I want to have a path to that function, and I want to pass that path to polomi so that polomi can help me deploy whatever is in that path to my Azure function app. That's just basically what it is. And for me to go even further, I want to show you two different files, and I want to show you why these two different files are important. So we have the polomi configs. So depending on how many polomi stacks you would have multiple configs. So now I have a stack I call the test stack. And your configs you can use your configs to specify things that you want to be different across your different stacks, across your different environments. It could be that, okay, you want for example, the location. That's one thing that we can use in this case. Let's say, okay, you want your test stack to be deployed to West Europe. You want your staging to be deployed to like a West US 2, and then you want your production to be deployed to like a France Central. In that kind of scenario, it's always easy to specify those details that are stack related, that are environment related in your polomi stack. And because of that, I have chosen, because even in the pipeline, I will be able to update my polomi stack config by running this command, polomi config set, whatever the config name is and the config value. I will be able to perform this update in the pipeline. And I'm trying to run away from scenarios where I have to hard code a deployment path, because what if things change and for whatever reason my function app does not build to that specific path anymore? Then I deploy something empty to my function app and I think that my function app is there when it's actually not there. So I want to be able to automate this whole process from the beginning to the end and not have to hard code at all. So we're going to be paying attention to the polomi config, to the polomi stack config, and we're also going to be paying attention to the command that will help us set our archive path. If we go back to the source code, we can see that we have created an instance of the polomi config so that we have access to that in the code, and we can now get config values from our config. So in this case, in the code, I will be able to get deployment archive config values and I can do whatever I want with it. So that means that when I set the value for my function deployment archive in the pipeline, and I run a polomi up, and polomi is going through all my code and doing all the things that it does to deploy infrastructure for me, what's going to happen is, because I ran that command, my config got updated. And when polomi gets to my code and sees that it requires the deployment archive config value from my config, it goes to fetch that. And because it's already there, it fetches that path, puts that path in my archive function app. And then when polomi is helping me create that archive function app, it creates it, it fetches the build function from the path that I've specified for my archive, and it goes ahead to deploy whatever is in that path to my function app itself. Sounds amazing, right? So when we run the command, as we can see already, the config get set, as we can see this. Now let's get to Azure pipelines. So this is what the pipeline would look like. Instead of running a polomi task, we're going to be running this script. And I've broken this script down into 2 different shell scripts. So I have a script to do setup, just in case I want to do the same setup somewhere else, so that I follow the programming rules that say don't repeat yourself. And I've broken these scripts down into 2 things. One that actually does all the setting up, and the other one that does the polomi CLI related things for me. And like I said initially, depending on where your polomi, you can decide to be using Polomi's cloud. And if you're using Polomi's cloud, then you'd have to pass in your access token to do authentication. But if you are using your own cloud, like you have your own storage account and your own storage blob, you would need to pass in like your ARM client secret, your subscription ID, your ARM client ID, and your ARM tenant ID. Because this thing today that I'm talking about in the pipeline currently works with service principal authentication. So you need service principal authentication to do what I'm saying that Polomi can do for you in the pipeline today. So let's look at our script for setting up. So what we're going to be doing is downloading Polomi, logging into Polomi, and downloading Node.js for our setup. So when it's time to run the Polomi CLI script, then it's important to add the path to the Polomi executable to our path environment variable. It's very important, so that when we try to run a Polomi command, it can pick it up and run. So the first thing we want to do is to switch to our Polomi path, the path where our Polomi project is. And in this case, it is the infra path. So I'm going to switch to infra, right? And then after doing that, I want to install npm, and I want to build my Polomi TypeScript project if that is necessary. Once I'm done doing that, I would want to select my stack that I'm in. And in this case, I'm using a test stack. So I go ahead and I run polomi stack select test. And after doing that, I can set my deployment archive config value. I go ahead and I set that config value to the archive path that I had already built, because initially I talked about this. Before we get to the polomi part, there will be a chance that the function that we actually have, we would have built it, we would have tested it, we would have published artifacts, we would have done all of that. So we publish the artifacts to a particular path, and that is the path that we want, because once we specify that path to Polomi goes to deploy whatever is in that path to our function. So I'm going to do a polomi config set deployment archive, and I'm going to put that path right there, and I'm passing it into this script, right? I'm passing the path into this script so that it's dynamic and I don't have to hard code this path at any time. And after doing this, I also run a polomi config get, just in case for whatever reason my path wasn't set, so that it fails early on and I know, just so that I don't go through that whole process of trying to run a polomi up and then it doesn't deploy anything, and I go to my function app and I see that my function is empty and I wonder why for a few hours. I don't want to get into that debugging rabbit hole, so I might just want to put this out there just to be sure that it actually sets before I move on. And after I have done the important things, which is after I have set up, after I have switched my stack, and after I have set my deployment archive, I can go ahead and just run my polomi up. And what's going to happen is polomi is going to create my Azure function app resource for me. Polomi is going to deploy the code in the path that I specified to that Azure function app for me, and I did not have to do it in more than one step. So on that note, we've seen how we can be able to use Polomi to deploy both our infrastructure and our source code in one step. And like I said earlier on, this works beyond functions, right? I talked about the archive function app because it's a lot easy, but I've also done this with Docker as well. So I know for a fact that this actually works. All you need to do is update the container registry and Polomi, and when you run a Polomi up, Polomi goes ahead to redeploy the thing for you. So in this case where we were updating our deployment archive path for functions, if you were doing some kind of Docker or Kubernetes related things, you would probably need to update your container registry as well, and it's the same effect. It goes ahead to redeploy, it checks the current state, and if there's any change at all, it redeploys the thing for you. So now you might be wondering, if Polomi is able to do this for me, what happens next time when I did not make any changes to my infrastructure but I have updated my code? And because I have updated my code, I want to obviously deploy the updated code to Polomi. Like I said, states. The new path in your archive function app is not going to be the same as the path that you had before, because once you do like a c/archive/path2/ at least something will be different, even if it's just the build ID of the function. And because of that, Polomi takes that up and goes ahead to redeploy that function to that function app for you every time. So because the state is different from when you did it yesterday at 4 p.m. and now that you want to do it again today at 2 p.m., Polomi says that the current state and the new proposed state are not the same because the path to the archives are not the same, right? So Polomi goes ahead to redeploy that function on your behalf, and Polomi does that every time. So it will never be the case of, because you did not update your infrastructure code, you are not going to get your updated source code. So far as every time you run the pipeline, you build the code. If that happens, then Polomi would always help you redeploy that build code to your function or to the container or whatever it is that you need, depending on how many times you do it. So on this note, like I said earlier, we can now use Polomi to deploy our infra and our source code in one step, and that makes me really excited. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching my talk. Like I said, I'm really honored to be giving this talk, and I'm glad that I gave this talk. And on that note, thank you and bye.